Hello, hello. Welcome to the 9th annual Prairie's Got the Goods Week. My name is Caitlin Rose Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Dr. Lauren Bortolotti, a research scientist with Ducks Unlimited Canada, will be speaking about measuring nature's benefits, a wetland ecosystem services tool for Prairie Canada. I'd like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Before we get going, I'd like to mention that PCAP has a couple more webinars happening this week. Also, this afternoon, we have a coffee table conversation where we'll be interviewing a lifelong agricultural producer, and that's at 3 p.m. We also have another one. It's called a virtual coffee table conversation happening tomorrow at 3 p.m. And you can register for all the PCAP webinars on the PCAP website. Just click on upcoming events and then Prairie's Got the Goods Week. This webinar will be recorded as have other webinars, and you can find that on the PCAP YouTube channel. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, just type it into the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard anytime, and questions will be answered towards the end of the webinar, and everyone will be muted for the duration of the presentation. So Prairie's Got the Goods Week is presented by Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, North American Helium, Nutrien, and SaskTel. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce today's presenter. Lauren is a research scientist with Ducks Unlimited Canada's Institute for Wetland and Waterfowl Research. Her research aims to advance conservation in Canada through 4 avenues. 1, quantification of benefits of nature to society. 2, the creation of conservation decision support tools. 3, the evaluation of conservation programming to improve program design. And 4, addressing fundamental knowledge gaps related to the implementation of nature-based climate solutions. Lauren has a PhD in ecology from the University of Alberta and a Bachelor of Science in biology from the University of Saskatchewan. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Caitlin, for that introduction. So I want to say that I'm speaking to you from my home in Winnipeg, which is Treaty 1 territory. This is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji, Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And as Caitlin said, I really make this acknowledgement in gratitude for the stewardship that these peoples have shown to the waters and the lands that I live on and will be talking about. So I'm very happy to be here. Thanks, Caitlin, for inviting me to participate in the series, and thanks everybody for joining. The first thing I wanted to say is that this webinar series is typically focused on grasslands, and I'm going to talk about mostly wetlands today. But to me, the prairies are the grasslands and the wetlands together. They're a continuous and integrated landscape with many of the same conservation pressures and opportunities. And so I hope if you're primarily interested in grasslands, you're still going to get something out of this talk. So before I dive into telling you about this research, I want to acknowledge that the work I'm talking about today involves the efforts of a lot of my wonderful colleagues. So top row here is Llewellyn Armstrong, Paige Cowell, Pascal Beju, and Lyle Boychuk. And in the bottom row, Brian Page and James Patterson, Lee Van Arden, and Jim DeVries. So I want to thank them for their contributions to this work. So for those of you who are not familiar with Ducks Unlimited Canada, we're an environmental nonprofit organization. Our mission is to conserve, restore, and manage wetlands and associated habitats for North America's waterfowl. The associated habitats would include things like grasslands. These habitats benefit other wildlife, people, and our environment, and it's really these benefits we're going to be talking about today. We have conserved or restored around 6.2 million acres in Canada. Some of you may associate us more so with wetlands, but that acreage is pretty much 50-50 split between wetlands and grasslands. And although Ducks Unlimited Canada operates coast to coast in Canada, a large proportion of our work occurs in the Canadian prairies, simply because of the importance of this region to waterfowl. So the prairie pothole region supports more than half of the continental breeding population of waterfowl. And from a wetland perspective, there are parts of the Canadian prairies that remain relatively intact. They might look like this photo you see here. Abundant wetlands on the landscape, maybe some signs of alteration of drainage. But in areas where drainage is possible, we do sometimes see high rates of wetland loss or drainage. And this represents a loss of waterfowl habitat, but also a loss of many wetland ecosystem services. And ecosystem services are simply the benefits that nature provides to people. And of course, these landscape changes often go hand in hand with grassland loss because the driver here is typically conversion to annual crops. So we often talk about how Ducks Unlimited Canada's work to conserve and restore habitats benefit other wildlife and people, and we regularly discuss the many ecosystem services that wetlands provide. So for example, they help mitigate flooding, they help purify water, which can protect downstream water bodies from problems like algal blooms, they store carbon, and they provide habitat for more than just waterfowl. The work I'm going to be sharing with you today is all about modeling and quantification of these wetland ecosystem services in Prairie Canada. And you might be asking, why do we want to quantify these ecosystem services? So for me personally, I find inherent value in nature. I think that it's great to have wildlife and natural spaces just because there's an inherent value in that. But not everybody shares that worldview. And at its heart, quantification of ecosystem services is about generating information that's persuasive to people who don't have that worldview. So that might be decision makers, might be potential new supporters, and it's all about broadening the tent of people who support conservation to achieve better conservation outcomes. So the work I'm talking about today seeks to model wetland ecosystem services in the Prairies ecozone, or the parts of it that we have good wetland mapping for. And we're trying to model ecosystem services, including wetland volume, so the amount of water that a wetland is holding, which we use as a proxy for these water regulation or flood mitigation functions, nutrient retention, so that water purification, carbon storage, and biodiversity support. And our modeling happens at a 16 square mile grid scale. So 16 square miles is roughly 64 quarter sections. And this results in about 10,800 grid cells across our area of interest. The data that inform the decision support tool we're building are derived from numerous field studies that have occurred over multiple decades. So the watersheds in orange on this map are areas that contribute data to the nutrient retention modules. So in Alberta, we have Camrose Creek. We have a number of watersheds in Manitoba that were sampled by a colleague at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And then some watersheds in the Sewers River watershed that include parts of the US. The blue area is Cactus Lake, Saskatchewan, and that contributes data to the wetland volume module. And then there are two small green watersheds on that map that are Smith Creek and Broughton's Creek, and they contribute data on both the nutrient and the water fronts. The red dots are wetlands that have been cored for the carbon module. And then our biodiversity module is derived from a different scientific tool that we've built called the Prairie Biodiversity Mapping and Assessment Tool, which uses citizen science data and systematic monitoring data to feed into models of the presence of birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians in this region. If you would like to read more about this tool, this QR code will take you to the publication associated with it. It's open access. But I will just flag too that we're going to have a public-facing version of this biodiversity tool soon, so watch for announcements about that becoming available in the near future. So I'm not going to walk you through all of the models and how we built them, but I do want to give you one example of how we turn field data into these estimates of wetland ecosystem services. And I'll use the nutrient module, so the nitrogen in particular, as an example. So the nutrient module is based off watershed scale nutrient monitoring. We had about 172 watershed year combinations. And that comes from about 20 different watersheds in Prairie Canada and then dipping into the US. Many of these data were collected by my colleagues Pascal and Brian or Dr. Henry Wilson at AFC. And typically what was involved was monitoring of water flows and nutrient concentrations at the outlets of watersheds, which are often culverts, which is why you see a lot of pictures of people hanging out at culverts. From these data, we can learn something about the nutrient export from watersheds. And what export is it's basically how much nutrients are coming off the landscape, which in this region happens with water. So nutrients are dissolved in water, and as water moves over the fields, some of it is captured in wetlands, but some of it moves into creeks and then downstream to the watershed outlet for measurement by Pascal and Brian. And so what we then do is we have this great data on watershed nutrient export, and we use what we know about this system and the scientific literature to form hypotheses about what's driving nutrient export, and then construct statistical models related to those hypotheses. So our best model of nitrogen export suggested that export was influenced by runoff, so the amount of water coming off the landscape, which is typically basically snowmelt events, the amount of wetlands within that watershed, the amount of cropland within the watershed, and the amount of trees in the watershed. And the graph on the right is showing you the influence of runoff and wetlands on nitrogen export. And the way to interpret this graph is that the y-axis is showing you total nitrogen export in kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year versus the percent composition of wetlands within that watershed. And it's showing you this effect for 3 different levels of runoff. So runoff equal to 1 millimeter, which is the bright blue line, is equivalent to a very dry year in the prairie. So there's almost no runoff. And what happens is when there's almost no water, there's almost no nutrients moving. So you don't have much an effect, which is why that line is pretty flat and near zero. But when we have a high runoff year, a wet year, say 200 millimeters of runoff, the pattern we see is that we have much higher nutrient export when we have fewer wetlands on the landscape. And the more wetlands you get on the landscape, the less nitrogen is exported from the uplands and ends up going downstream and leaving the watershed. That same effect happens at 25 millimeters of runoff, which is like an average year. It's just a little bit less pronounced. And I do just want to note there are sort of bands around the different lines of runoff. Those are confidence intervals, so giving us a sense of the uncertainty of our model. And in some areas that uncertainty is high, in part because this graph is showing you sort of areas that are not very representative of the prairies. So we don't typically have watersheds that are 100% wetlands, which is what the right-hand side of this graph represents. So most of the area that actually exists in the prairies would be on the left-hand side of that vertical dotted gray line. So watersheds where we have 40% or less wetland cover. So now that we have a model of nitrogen export, can do a little bit more work with that to turn that into nutrient retention, and then use the model to predict wetland retention across any 16 square mile grid. And what you get is a map that looks like this. So this is total nitrogen retention for every 16 square mile grid. The darker green areas represent more nitrogen retention, so higher levels of wetland ecosystem services. And the black outlines are the prairie habitat joint venture priority areas. So represent areas where most wetland related conservation delivery is occurring in this landscape. The spatial patterning you see here really represents that you tend to have higher nutrient retention values in areas with more wetlands, but especially in higher runoff areas. So again, you don't really have nutrient movement unless you have water moving. So areas where you have higher levels of runoff, larger spring snowmelts, you're going to have higher nutrient retention values. Now, I haven't presented the statistical models for all of this work, but I want to give you a glimpse of what the results look for the other modules. So top left is our model of wetland volume. Top right is phosphorus retention, so a different nutrient. Bottom left is soil organic carbon, so wetland carbon storage. And bottom right is wetland biodiversity expressed as species richness, so just number of species. And you can see that when we line up all these module outputs, there are some commonalities. So for example, both the water volume module and the carbon module tend to have hotspots of ecosystem services lighting up in areas where we have more wetlands, and that tends to align with where we tend to be delivering conservation in this region. Whereas the phosphorus retention module has a lot in common with the nitrogen retention, where runoff is really driving the hotspots that we see. And then for wetland biodiversity, we've got different patterns yet again, where we actually see, very high predicted levels of biodiversity for much of the region. These are for wetland associated species, and there's about 136 in this region. So that top bracket of 91 to 112 is suggesting that we have, near maximum richness for a lot of these areas. So this kind of information on the total wetland ecosystem services has multiple possible applications. For example, communicating the benefits of what these ecosystems are doing for society, or economic valuation of these services. However, I want to tell you about a different application of this kind of work, which is creating a conservation decision support tool to guide conservation planning and decision making. And for that application, instead of thinking about total ecosystem services, we need to shift our thinking a little bit and think about incremental gain in ecosystem services. And what I mean by that is, for an investment in X amount of wetland conservation or restoration, what is the incremental gain over and above what's already on the landscape that you get back from that investment? And this thinking is really about figuring out how to maximize return on investment from conservation actions and use limited conservation dollars wisely to have the greatest effect. So to illustrate why we do this shift in thinking, this figure is showing you the relationship between incremental gain versus total ecosystem services, using carbon as an example. So the y-axis is the total wetland carbon, which was the green map you saw previously. The y-axis is the incremental gain in wetland carbon, and each of these points represents one of those 16 square mile grid cells. And in some cases, the total ecosystem services and the incremental gain are highly related, but there are instances where they're not. So for example, where the arrow indicates at the top of the graph, what we have here are areas of this region where we have high carbon density, so high incremental gain value, but low total carbon, simply because we don't have a lot of wetlands there. In contrast, on the right-hand side of this figure, what we have are areas with moderate carbon density, so moderate incremental gain, but high total carbon areas, because we have high wetland areas. So looking at just the total ecosystem services information alone means we could miss certain patterns that are important for thinking on return on investment. So for many of the modules, there's some additional calculation needed to make that switch from total ecosystem services to incremental gain. But when we do those calculations, this is what the resulting maps look like. So top left is nitrogen retention, top right is phosphorus retention, bottom left is soil organic carbon, bottom right is wetland species richness. As before, we have some commonalities. So for example, in the nutrient retention modules, again, we're seeing areas of high runoff really light up, but we have different spatial patterns for carbon and biodiversity. So for carbon, the patterns you see there are largely driven by climatic influences in the model. And for wetland biodiversity, the model is suggesting that for the vast majority of this area, we would only see modest gains in species richness, so that sort of widespread color is 0 to 3 species, with sort of small changes in wetland area. So simulating a small amount of wetland restoration is essentially what we're doing. And I do want to take a second to explain that result. So if you think back to the map of wetland biodiversity, in green, what we were seeing is that the model is predicting near maximum biodiversity for most areas, which simply means that the room for gains is small. But that doesn't mean that there's not value to conservation programming like wetland restoration. basically, habitat conservation and restoration can support the abundance of organisms, not just their diversity, but the modeling approach we used here doesn't capture those abundance benefits. So for example, you could restore a wetland and it might attract ducks to it, but you might not get any new species of ducks because perhaps all the species are already present in other wetlands on the landscape. But what it does is it changes the number of ducks that can occupy the landscape. So you get more ducks, just not more species. So the ultimate aim for these incremental gain layers is inclusion into a decision support tool. And this is a work in progress, so we're not quite there yet. But I'll tell you a little bit more about that shortly. As an interim step, what we've done to help us better visualize what happens when you combine all these layers, my colleague Paige has used a software called Zonation to basically combine these 4 layers so that you're not trying to, eyeball comparisons between maps. And we've also incorporated some data on risk of wetland loss or risk of wetland drainage. And we've incorporated this information into the analysis because we think that this is one element of thinking about return on investment and conservation prioritization. So essentially higher returns from conservation in areas where you have higher risk of wetland loss. When you combine this information in zonation, this is the result you get. So the way to read this map is that zonation is suggesting that the red areas are of higher priority for conservation than the blue areas. Basically because you would get greater returns related to levels of ecosystem services or related to that risk of loss information. So different spatial patterning yet again, but the map you're seeing here is really all about the biophysical benefits of conservation work. And the next step in this research is to integrate this modeling into something that we call the cost tool. So the cost tool is a decision support tool built by Jim DeVries and other Ducks Unlimited Canada colleagues. And the cost tool takes that biophysical information and it also integrates economic information. So currently it's a waterfowl only tool and it includes data on cost of conservation delivery, duck density, habitat availability, duck productivity, risk of habitat loss. It's really driven by something called a conservation planning model that Jim published recently, but it's a really powerful tool because it is adding in this cost of conservation delivery and this economic information. So although we haven't yet had a chance to incorporate the wetland ecosystem services into the cost tool, I'm going to walk you through one example from the existing waterfowl only tool to illustrate how combining biophysical and economic inputs can provide unique and valuable insights. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of inputs to the cost tool, but one of the most important biological inputs is nest survival. So nest survival just means basically if a duck lays some eggs, they're incubating a nest, what's the chance that that nest is going to survive to produce ducklings? And this is a rate, a demographic rate, we say, that strongly influences population fluctuations and is very influential on the incremental hatched nest, which is the unit that the cost tool kind of runs on. So as you can see from the map, nest survival rates vary in this region. So the darker blue colors represent higher nest survival rates, and the highest predicted rates are for the southern and western reaches of the Canadian prairies. So that's one kind of biologic variation. Now economic variation. So again, lots of inputs, but one influential economic input is land value. And I apologize, this map is not colorblind friendly. If you can't see the colors, what it's telling us is that land values are higher in Alberta, especially the western edge of Alberta. We also have moderately high land values at the eastern edge in Manitoba and around the cities of Saskatoon and Regina. But by and large, the cheapest land values occur en masse in Saskatchewan. So the cost tool combines that biophysical information and economic inputs. This time I'm visualizing a wetland restoration scenario. And this is the map of the resulting suggested prioritization for wetland restoration. So red squares have a rank of 1 and represent the most cost-effective places to work. Blue, or 10, is the least cost-effective. And we can decompose some of these patterns to see the combined effects of biological and economic factors in these outputs. So the blue patterning that you see in Alberta, sort of the northern edge, it's blue, it's not cost effective because it's got high conservation cost of delivery and low nest survival rates. Contrast that with the southern part of the province, where we still have high cost of conservation delivery, but we have high nest survival now. So we have high biological value, and that's going to flip it from being cost ineffective to cost effective. But the sweet spot, low cost, high nest survival, that's largely occurring in Saskatchewan. So this isn't to say that we use this information to blindly follow what it tells us. We don't only deliver wetland restorations in these red zones. Conservation decision support tools are meant to guide conservation decisions, not make them for us. Obviously, conservation delivery exists in the real world where there are real, actual constraints that would make it impractical to do exactly what this tool says, but it still provides us with important information to learn how we can maximize our return on investment from the limited resources we have to invest in conservation. So I'm very excited to be able to soon incorporate our wetland ecosystem services into the same framework, as I do think that adding in those economic dimensions can provide important insights, and it'll be useful to examine these other benefits from conservation work alongside the waterfowl benefits. So to wrap up, there are numerous benefits that flow from the conservation of waterfowl habitat. The benefits of wetland and grasslands have long been known, but there is a specific utility in quantifying them. And there's a big difference between being able to say that wetlands filter water versus wetlands remove X tons of phosphorus each year. And decision support tools that quantify ecosystem services can help us answer questions about how much and where conservation needs to happen. And we hope will also underpin confidence in increasing support for habitat conservation in Canada. Again, we're quantifying these benefits to make conservation appealing to a broader audience and help everybody understand the widespread benefits that flow from conservation of habitats in this landscape. With that, I want to thank Dr. Henry Wilson at AFC for sharing his phosphorus data with us, and just note that there are so many individuals, too many to name, who have contributed to the field data collection over about 20 years, and similarly many funders of that field research. Those contributions are greatly appreciated. And with that, I think I've left plenty of time for questions.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for the awesome presentation. So informative. And as you can imagine, there's quite a few questions in already. And so there's a couple regarding kind of the last slides that you were showing. An attendee named Andrea is wondering, what about Saskatchewan makes it more cost effective?
Good question. There are a number of economic inputs, so it can be hard to pinpoint exactly. But land values are very important. Fundamentally, land values in many parts of Saskatchewan are lower than in, for example, Alberta. I will say those data are now a little bit out of date. If anybody's really familiar with land values, you're probably going like, oh, it's more expensive than that. We're updating the model. We'll have more modern values soon, but land value is very important because we're simulating a lot of conservation programs that involve securement of land in some way. So conservation easements are tied to, the price of land. Purchases by DUC would be tied to the price of land. Even, the way we simulate lease rates, it's related as sort of a percentage of fair market values. So land values is one of the primary drivers of that.
Okay. And Sheila's wondering, is it known why there's an increased duck nest success in southwest area of the region?
That's a really good question. We think it has a lot to do with predator communities. So the main cause of a nest failure is depredation, and just the abundance and the types of predators that exist does vary sort of east to west and north to south. And so that's the likely cause of that gradient in nest survival.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. And Holly's wondering, is the conservation decision support tool available online, or is there a technical report associated with it?
Not yet. We're hoping to get there. As I mentioned, the biodiversity tool will be very soon available. Um, we'll circulate an announcement in places like the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture newsletter. Caitlin, if you're okay, I can let you know, and you could potentially include it in your newsletter to alert people that it's sort of now available. My hope is we'll have the same kind of publicly available interface for this. We're just in a little bit earlier stages and the work is still in progress, but we're moving in that direction.
Absolutely, yeah, and of course, let us know when we can include it in the PCAP newsletter. I think we reach out to like over 3,000 people now, so it's a normal way to get information out.
Right.
And Susanna's wondering, are watersheds able to be included on the tool, and is there a way to scale down to determine prioritization within the watersheds?
Yeah, so the tool runs on 16 square mile grids, but it is possible to summarize the information at different scales. I will say, for example, we have shared this data sometimes with other partners for use in watershed planning, and I won't specifically mention them because I haven't asked them if that's okay, but you can absolutely, take a look at the outputs of the model for a specific watershed and use that for, say, within watershed priority planning. There's a lot of flexibility in that. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Um, and David says in both the aggregate ecosystem services map and the cost tool map, there was a less than perfect alignment with PH JV priority areas. Is there work underway to make these more congruent?
That's a really good question. I mean, the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture involves multiple stakeholders, and I will say that the joint venture is I mean, I've presented this work to them. I think you will see this work in future updates of their implementation plan. I don't think what you'll see is a redrawing of priority areas because there are reasons why that's primarily based on waterfowl, potentially soon incorporating more all birds values. But the way I see this information as being useful is it allows you to ask, where are there areas where we get really high return on investment that we're not currently investing in? Where should we be investing in? So to me, that's one way we can use this information, even if we don't redraw those priority areas.
Absolutely, that makes sense. And personally, I was kind of excited to see my area of the province was in the priority area. I thought that was pretty neat.
Lighting up, yeah.
Yeah. And Ross is wondering, what roles does DUC owned land play in research partnerships?
Ooh, that's a great question. Well, DUC owned land has had value to research in numerous ways. So for one, it's been invaluable in field data collection. So getting on the ground field measurements requires permission to access land. And so
Mhm.
DUC owned properties are really convenient because it's very easy for us to secure permission to get on that land and do research. We also have DUC owned land like Touchwood Hills Ranch, which is a demonstration farm and has value in sort of disseminating knowledge about research. We also use DUC lands in, for example, in the biodiversity tool to actually run realistic scenarios to understand the value of securing land to biodiversity. It's a really multifaceted kind of value that DUC owned properties brings to research from my experience. I'm sure others could contribute more examples, but that's how I've seen the value.
Yeah, and in Saskatchewan, there's a new trespassing act, and we've heard about this many times at our partnership. And one of the things that people, one perspective is that it's harder to do research because it's hard to get a hold of people, and then the land may not be right. So having that available for researchers is probably a huge asset.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and Andrea's wondering, is it possible to incorporate wetland conservation projects without acquiring land? And just, for example, just working with landowners.
Yes, absolutely. So the cost tool results that I showed were specific to a wetland restoration scenario, but we actually run multiple kinds of scenarios through our cost tool. And one example of a scenario that we run that doesn't involve land securement would be DUC's forage program. It's more so relevant to grasslands than wetlands, but basically our forage program involves landowners signing a 10-year agreement to establish forage on their land, keep it there for 10 years. And the economic inputs to those scenarios reflect the fact that there isn't land securement. And I can tell you that does tend to make the programming look more cost effective. So basically, any conservation mechanism you could dream up, we could try and simulate that, and you would just need to basically make decisions about what the right economic inputs are to really get that. But yes, you can absolutely simulate, and we do simulate conservation programs that don't have securement involved.
Awesome. Thanks for that answer. And Mike is wondering, in your opinion, what actions do you think DUC can take to improve nutrient retention?
Oh, okay, let me think about that for a second. So when I think about what I know about nutrient retention and how we could be involved in sort of improving nutrient retention, there's, I guess, maybe two scales I would think about that at. You would ask about, how can I improve a singular basin and make that wetland more efficient at capturing nutrients? And I think that has a lot to do with just like making sure that the basin is functioning as it should. We've got intact, emergent vegetation. And then the other scale I would think about that question at is at a broader scale. And that would have to do more so about targeting maybe where we would restore wetlands. So I've talked a lot about the prairies. We also have programming on wetland restoration in Ontario. And, Lake Erie has very severe water quality problems. And Ducks Unlimited Canada has done a lot of research on sort of the nutrient retention values of wetlands there for Lake Erie. And so we deliver wetland restoration sort of with a specific aim of protecting that lake. Similarly, our wetland restorations are involved in sort of protection and stewardship of Lake Winnipeg, which also has these water quality issues. And so I think just always improving our knowledge of where we can deliver in the landscape to be most impactful to protecting those downstream lakes. The model that I talked about today doesn't really simulate this, but of course you need to understand where does the water go. Um, uh, and so improving our knowledge of targeting and just our ability to get people to work with us on that, right? Because conservation, as I said, has real world constraints, and you can't just work wherever you want because land tends to be privately owned. So just continuing to work on gaining support for sort of partnership with private landowners, I think is also beneficial, so that when we know there's a particularly valuable area to deliver on, that we find ways to make that happen.
Thanks for that answer. And Clint is wondering, or comments, the higher land value areas are most subject to wetland removal and therefore are most at risk for negative effects to the landscape regarding nutrient loss, etc. The best bang for your buck areas are least at risk to degradation. And the red areas in your map don't really need investment in protection. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, that's a good point. So we do incorporate risk of habitat loss in our models to try to offset that a little bit, because we recognize that those patterns exist. And as I said, the models we use to guide decisions, not make decisions. So I would say that the actual decision making, even if the models can only offset the land value issue a little bit with wetland loss rates or habitat risk of loss rates in it, that is a lens that is used in actual decision making. Yeah.
And we have a few comments from Sherry. So the first one, she said it's not exactly a theory, a question, but we have a theory of how sediment is also causing nutrients to be less likely from spring snowmelt, include dissolved oxygen and reduction of nitrogen, and does that or can this cause runoff to be less and less? And she said her friend Carl Hunt, retired biologist, studied this for trout and came up with the slogan SOS H2O, save our streams from headwaters to oceans. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, I mean, Sherry, you're talking about you're really delving into the details here. The models are sometimes a bit of a simplification in terms of representing these things. We're limited by the availability of data for model predictions, but that's great insight into what's going on in this landscape. And again, that's part of keeping in mind that important knowledge of how the landscape is working as we think about how to do this effectively.
And Sherry also comments that researchers found that less than 5 to 8% of water, the water capacity in the headwaters and natural water storage is happening in some other water bodies. Beaver dam analogs, natural stream restoration, and the process from unhealthy to adding meandering and bringing it back to life. Woody plants and built and widening the branches and beavers can return. These analogs are being built and beaver dam analogs, which will cause the water to be dammed. And how this would can this sort of stuff be included in the cost tool?
That's an interesting question. I'll say that many of the factors that you're describing aren't explicitly simulated in our models, but are somewhat implicitly incorporated. So that nutrient retention module, as I described, is based on watershed scale modeling. And so because it's based on those large scales, we know that those things are happening on the landscape. And so there's almost certainly some of that already going on in the landscapes that we are modeling, right? So in some ways that's been accounted for just because we are measuring, real world landscapes where all those factors are at play. Did we explicitly quantify that? Could I tell you to what extent that's happening in those watersheds? No, I can't. But I think that the real world data are really very messy, but the benefit of them is that the messiness comes from being influenced by those real factors. So in some ways, those get sort of sneakily incorporated into the models.
Okay. And there's a few questions about what is the outlook on development of this tool for use in the Interlake area of Manitoba? It would be very beneficial to be able to apply this information for this area, but currently would not serve a purpose.
Yeah, I hear you. The Interlake is this comes up a lot. I mean, I love the Interlake. I live in Manitoba. I would love to be able to simulate this stuff. One of the challenges is lack of input data still. So I mentioned that, we say we're modeling the prairies ecozone, but one of the things that limits us is high quality wetland data. And so I think that there are some foundational data that need to be collected for the Interlake before we could extend this. We do have some input data that cover parts of the Interlake, but it's that foundational wetland mapping is one of the things we're missing. And so I think there needs to be a little bit of work on that. And I'm hopeful that as we develop new mapping methods and things like that, that maybe that's information that's coming.
Okay, perfect. That's great. And Michael says in areas like Smith Creek with lots of wetland drainage, does the cost tool support doing any conservation work in this type of area, or is it too far gone? What's the tipping point of behind doing work or not?
That's a good question. The cost tool definitely doesn't have a threshold like that where we say this is too far gone. I've certainly heard people describe the Red River Valley like that there's just been so much wetland loss that the watershed functions of wetlands really break down. So far, no decision to not work in those areas though. And again, that's sort of a human decision, not one that is made by me. That happens, that's conservation leadership's decision. But as far as I know, to my knowledge, there's been no decision yet, like, oh, we don't work there because it's too far gone.
Okay, that's good to know. There's still hope. Um, and Cody's wondering, where will it be available once released? And he says he's very interested in using this tool towards justifying purchase and acquisition of potential conservation sites.
Yeah, I think the vision will be like the biodiversity tool to see this hosted on the Ducks Unlimited Canada website, and I'll try and use these same kind of platforms. If you're plugged into PCAP, if you're plugged into the PHJB policy newsletter, we'll try and make sure that we advertise developments on this work so that people know when these things become available.
Okay, perfect. And what do you think are the next steps from here? Like you've got this really cool tool. So where's Ducks gonna go with it?
Well, what we're currently working on is the integration of the cost tool. That
Mhm.
requires some sort of extra calculations and science there. We are working on expanding the things that we simulate. So I would like, currently our carbon storage is all about sort of wetland sediments, what's in the wetland soils. I would like to have a greenhouse gas module. So expanding the carbon work that way. And I'm interested in doing a better job of capturing that sort of flood mitigation function. So trying to work with partners to see if maybe some of their data could be brought to bear just to expand the functionality of the tool and the number of services that it's covered. That's the immediate horizon for this. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And when do you think it will be available or fully functional? Do you have a timeline in mind?
That is a good question. I hate to commit to anything. A year?
No problem.
I'll work hard. I'll try and make it. I'll try and make it happen.
No vacations for you. Just keep working. And we have a few people who work for different watershed districts and are interested in connecting with you. What's the best way for people to reach out to you?
You can email me. So it would only flashed up on the screen briefly, but my email is l_Bortolotti@ducks.ca.
Okay, perfect. And people can always reach out to PCAP too, and then we can connect as well. And hopefully you can make some new connections following this webinar.
Great.
That's kind of all the questions that we have right now. So if anyone has any last minute questions for Lauren, please feel free to type it in. And just while I give everyone a minute to do that, I just want to remind everyone that today we have a virtual coffee table conversation with a lifelong rancher from near Frontier, Saskatchewan, Art McElroy. And he has a lot of experience doing grassland restoration, rotational grazing, that sort of thing. So it should be really interesting. We also had a webinar tomorrow about NCC's grassland conservation plan. And we have a webinar on Friday about cows, carbon, and grassland. So it should be really interesting. For some reason, Facebook found it controversial. So I wasn't allowed to advertise for it. So I just want to get that out there because our registration numbers are a little bit lower for that one. But yeah, it doesn't look like we have any more questions coming in, Lauren. So I just want to say thank you so much for this really informative presentation and for the work that you're doing. It's really amazing. And it's not something that just anyone can do. So we really appreciate you doing this work and sharing it with us today. So thank you, Lauren.
Thanks for your kind words and thanks for having me.
And thanks everyone for catching today's webinar, and hopefully we'll see you online at another point this week. So with that, thanks so much everyone and have a great rest of your day. Bye now.